The inferno that devoured the Gilded Cage saloon could be seen from 3 counties away, a legend born of whiskey and fire. But it hadn't started with a gunshot or a poker game gone wrong. It started hours earlier with a quiet tug on the sleeve of Silas Blackwood's $1,000 coat. Silas, a man who measured his life in cattle by the thousand and land by the league, had come to the dusty town of Redemption for a simple business transaction. Then, a little girl with eyes that held the grief of a lifetime held up a single grimy silver dollar. She didn't weep or beg for charity. She tried to make a deal. "My mama," she whispered, her voice cracking. "That's what the saloon man says she's worth." In that moment, for a man who could buy and sell the entire town without a thought, the world fractured. The choice was no longer about business. It was about correcting a balance in the universe, and Silas Blackwood was prepared to settle the debt first in gold and then in cleansing fire. He had spent the morning erasing a man from the map, not with a bullet, but with the quiet, devastating finality of a signature. From his temporary office above the land registry, Silas watched Jonas Cartwright ride out of town, a man who had been a rival just an hour before and was now simply gone. Silas had acquired his water rights, his grazing lands, his brand. The victory was total, elegant, and it left him feeling nothing at all. He looked over the valley map, a sprawling testament to his will, a world he owned but could no longer feel. The silence in the room was a familiar weight, the same dense, suffocating silence that filled the 22 rooms of his ranch house back east, a monument to a family that existed only in memory. He saw not the sprawling empire on the paper, but the small, ghostly handprint of his daughter, left on a dusty windowpane years ago. He packed his leather satchel, the clicks of the brass latches loud in the still air. Business was concluded. There was nothing left for him here. The town of Redemption was just another asset, a square on his map to be managed and controlled, a place utterly devoid of surprises. He stepped out into the searing, white-hot glare of the main street. The air was thick with the smells of horse manure, stale beer, and the oppressive metallic scent of sun-baked dust. A blacksmith's hammer fell in a steady rhythmic clang, a lonely heartbeat for a dying town. Silas set his path for the livery, his stride measured and purposeful. He saw the world in lines and trajectories, and his was a straight line to his waiting carriage. Then the trajectory broke. It was the smallest of things, a pressure on the fabric of his coat so light he almost dismissed it. He stopped. He didn't look down at first, but at the hand itself. Small, streaked with grime, the nails bitten to the quick. It wasn't the hand of a beggar seeking a coin, but the hand of a worker gripping a tool. He followed the line of the thin arm up to a face that was all eyes, enormous, dark, and holding a sorrow so old it felt ancient. The little girl, no older than his own daughter would have been, wasn't looking at his face, but at his vest pocket, where the cold glint of his silver watch chain was visible. He was just another obstacle in her path. "Move, child," he said, his voice a low rumble, not unkind but not patient. She didn't flinch. Instead, she opened her tiny clenched fist. Lying on her palm was a single silver dollar, its surface worn smooth with time and worry. It was her entire world, offered up in a desperate final transaction. "My mama," she whispered, and the sound was like dry leaves skittering across pavement. "That's what the saloon man says she's worth." Her gaze finally lifted to his, and it was not a plea. It was a business proposition from one who had nothing left to trade but the truth. "Will you buy her back for me?" The hammer in the distance fell silent. For Silas Blackwood, a man who had moved mountains with the stroke of a pen, the weight of that single tarnished coin was suddenly unbearable. The carefully constructed walls around his heart, the ledgers, the contracts, the vast, empty landscapes of his empire crumbled to dust. The world he saw in neat, controllable lines fractured into a million jagged pieces, and at the center of it all was the ghost of his own little girl, asking a question he had failed to answer all those years ago. He knelt, an act so foreign to him it felt like his joints were cracking. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, met the child's. He saw her now, not as a problem, but as a debt that had come due, a debt that had nothing to do with money. "Yes," he said, the word a stone dropped into the well of his soul. "I will." He didn't take her dollar. He stood, his immense frame casting a long, protective shadow over her. His path was no longer a straight line to the livery. It was a sharp, brutal turn towards the swinging doors of the gilded cage saloon, towards the reckoning that awaited inside. He had come to this town to make a purchase, and he would. But the price, he now understood, would be paid in something far more valuable than gold. The gilded cage fell silent as Silas Blackwood stepped inside. The sour stench of stale whiskey, cheap perfume, and unswept sawdust clawed at the back of his throat. He saw everything in a single cold appraisal: the leering men at the card tables, the frightened eyes of the women lining the bar, and the bloated predatory form of Jedediah Kane, sitting behind a scarred oak desk like a spider in the center of a filthy web. Silas ignored the rest, his focus narrowing to Kane alone. He walked with the slow, deliberate purpose of a glacier, an unstoppable force of nature that the grimy world of the saloon could not comprehend. "I am here on behalf of a shareholder," Silas began, his voice devoid of warmth, "who wishes to divest herself of an asset. A young girl, Alara, has presented me with a tender offer of $1 silver for the purchase of her mother." Kane let out a wet, gurgling laugh. "Is that so? Well, you can tell the little beggar the price has gone up." He leaned back, the chair groaning under his weight. "You want one of my girls, you buy all of them, every last one. That's the deal today." He was trying to humiliate him, to make this an unwinnable game. Silas didn't flinch. "A bulk acquisition, a sound business principle. Name your price for the entire inventory." Kane's greasy smile widened. He saw a rich fool, an Easterner ripe for the fleecing. He named a number that was not just exorbitant but impossible. A king's ransom, a sum designed to be a public slap in the face. "And I want it in cash," Kane sneered, spreading his hands. "On my desk, you've got 1 hour." The men in the saloon chuckled. It was a good show, but Silas simply nodded, a slight, almost imperceptible incline of his head. He turned to one of his men standing guard by the door. "John," he said calmly, "ride to Silver Creek. Telegraph my bank in St. Louis. Inform them I'm making a withdrawal. Have them wire the funds to the telegraph office here." He then turned his gaze back to Kane, his eyes as cold and empty as a winter sky. "Your hour has begun. I suggest you get your paperwork in order." The silence that followed was a different kind. It was the stunned silence of predators who have just realized they are in a much, much smaller cage than they thought. Silas Blackwood did not lose games. He simply changed the rules until the board was entirely his own. The clatter of the telegraph key was the only sound in town, a frantic metallic heartbeat counting down the seconds of Jedediah Kane's reign. The money arrived with 20 minutes to spare, not as a bag of gold, but as a quiet, civilized bank draft that felt infinitely heavier, infinitely more powerful. The deal was done. As Silas's men began escorting the women out of the saloon, a quiet procession of ghosts blinking in the harsh sunlight, Silas's gaze fell upon one woman in particular, Alara's mother, Serafina. She was a woman whose beauty was not just physical, but an act of defiance against the world that had tried to break her. As she passed, her eyes met his, and he saw not gratitude, but a profound, soul-deep weariness that he recognized. It was the look of someone who knew that this was not a rescue, just a change of ownership. "The deed is signed," his man, John, reported quietly at his side. "Her property now legally belongs to you." Silas felt a chill that had nothing to do with the desert evening. "Her property?" "Yes, sir," John said, confused. "The land registry confirmed it. She was Serafina Hayes. Her husband, Thomas, owned the parcel you just acquired, lost it to Kane in a poker game a month back. They say he shot himself the next day. Kane took the wife and kid as collateral." The world stopped. The architect's master plan, the elegant lines on his map, the cold, clean logic of his victory, it all shattered into a million pieces of broken glass. He hadn't just bought land. He had bought a woman's entire life, her entire history. His business deal, the final move in his masterful game, had been the legal instrument that validated her enslavement. He was not her savior. He was the man who had just purchased the final brick in her prison. The cold satisfaction he should have felt was replaced by a familiar, gut-wrenching dread. The dread of a powerful man who arrives too late. The dread of a father who chooses business over family. He saw the face of his own dying wife, a memory he had tried to bury under an empire of dirt and gold, and knew with sickening certainty that he had failed her all over again. His rage, when it came, was not hot, but cold. A silent, terrifying pressure building behind his eyes. His goal was no longer to fix a problem. It was to atone. But Cain, sensing the shift in the wind, had already made his own move. The town sheriff, a man whose spine was made of greed and whiskey, stepped in front of Silas, blocking his path. The sheriff wasn't holding a gun, he was holding a piece of paper, the deed with Silas Blackwood's own name on it. "Mr. Blackwood," the sheriff said, a smug, oily grin spreading across his face. "According to this legal document, you are the owner of the Hayes property and everything on it. As such, Mr. Cain here is the, shall we say, lawful guardian of your tenant, Mrs. Hayes, until all outstanding debts are settled." He gestured back toward the saloon. The law is the law. It was a perfect trap. His own power, his own wealth, his own signature, now wielded against him as a weapon. Every dollar he had spent, every contract he had signed, had only tightened the noose. The system he had mastered had now mastered him. All the money, all the land, all the control, it was meaningless. He was as powerless now as he had been in that quiet, sick room all those years ago, watching his own family slip through his fingers. He looked past the sneering sheriff, past the triumphant Cain, and saw Alara watching him, her small face a mask of confusion and dawning fear. He had made a promise, and he had failed. The despair was a physical weight, crushing the air from his lungs. It seemed for a moment that the world was simply made this way, that men like Cain always won, and men like him were doomed to build monuments to their own failures. He let his gaze drift away, past the men, towards the grimy interior of the sheriff's office. And that's when he saw it. Not a solution, not a plan, just a glimmer. A single kerosene lamp, its wick sputtering, casting a warm, wavering light against the coming dusk. A different kind of power, a power beyond contracts. Defeat was a taste he had forgotten. It was bitter, metallic, like old blood. From the window of his rented room, Silas Blackwood watched the town of Redemption breathe its corrupt, dusty air. Below, huddled on a bench outside the land office, were Seraphina and Alara. The woman was a statue of despair, but the little girl, Alara, was not. She had taken her mother's hand and was tracing patterns on the back of it with a small finger, her movements slow and deliberate, her small face set with a focus that was both heartbreaking and profound. She wasn't waiting for a savior. She was becoming one. And in that small, silent gesture, Silas's entire world inverted. His life had been a monument to the idea that power was control over land, over markets, over men. He had built an empire to insulate himself from the chaos that had stolen his family. But he saw now, with sickening clarity, that his very pursuit of control had made him an instrument of Cain's chaos. His laws, his contracts, his perfect, unassailable logic, they were all just bricks in a prison for the innocent. He had tried to control the world, and in the end, the only thing he had truly managed to do was hurt the very people he sought to protect. The image from the sheriff's office surfaced in his mind, the wavering, defiant light of the kerosene lamp. It was a different kind of power. Not the power to own, but the power to erase, to purify. A higher law, an epiphany settled over him, cold and clear as a winter morning. He would not play by the system's rules any longer. He would introduce his own. He turned from the window. The broken man was gone. In his place stood the architect once more, but this time he was designing a different kind of structure. He spent the next 2 hours in quiet, ruthless efficiency. There were no grand pronouncements. There was only a series of clipped, precise orders to his men. Wagons were procured from the livery, not with a request, but with an offer that made the owner feel like the luckiest man in the territory. Supplies were gathered from the general store, food, blankets, and a small, sturdy doll that Silas selected with intense private care. He saw to it personally that each of the women he'd freed was given a purse heavy with gold coin and a stagecoach ticket to any city in the West she chose. He was not giving them charity. He was dissolving a bad contract. By sunset, they were all gone, a quiet exodus under the cover of the deepening shadows, their passage secured by the invisible, far-reaching power of his name. His resources were now being used not for acquisition, but for liberation. The final piece of his plan was a single heavy can of kerosene, which he carried himself. His gun belt, which had sat packed in his luggage, he now buckled on. It felt both foreign and familiar. He checked the action on his Colt, the metallic click a clean, sharp sound in the quiet dusk. The board was set. The pieces were in position. The game was over. Now came the judgment. Night fell on Redemption, thick and starless. The gilded cage was an island of jarring, drunken light and sound in the darkness. Silas Blackwood approached not from the main street, but from the dark alley behind it. He didn't burst through the doors. He entered like a ghost, his face unreadable. Kane and the sheriff were at the bar, celebrating their victory with Silas's own whiskey. They looked up, their laughter dying in their throats as they saw him. "The show's over, Blackwood," the sheriff slurred, his hand hovering near his gun. "The law's been settled." "You are correct," Silas said, his voice a low, chilling calm. He reached into his coat. For a moment they thought he was going for a weapon. Instead, he placed something on the bar. It was the single grimy silver dollar the little girl had offered him. It slid across the sticky wood and came to a stop before Jedediah Kane. "A payment," Silas said, "for the souls you thought you owned." Kane stared at the coin, then back at Silas, confusion warring with greed. "What is this?" "The price," Silas answered. Then, with a fluid, almost lazy motion, he turned and threw the heavy bolt on the saloon's main door. The solid chunk of the iron sliding into place was the sound of a tomb being sealed. Terror dawned in Kane's eyes. "What are you doing?" Silas didn't answer. He simply began to walk the length of the bar, systematically dousing the floorboards with a steady stream of kerosene. The pungent fumes filled the room, a sacrament for the coming purification. The final confrontation was not a gunfight. It was an execution. It was brutal, efficient, and horrifyingly brief. Amidst the spreading flames and the black choking smoke, Silas Blackwood delivered a judgment that was not written in any law book. From the outside, the town watched in stunned, terrified silence as their corrupt heart was cauterized. The gilded cage burned with a fury that seemed alive, a hellish spectacle that lit up the night sky for miles. The fire was a promise and a warning, a cleansing. When the main doors finally splintered from the heat, a figure emerged from the inferno. He was no longer the pristine, wealthy architect. He was a creature of ash and righteous fury, his face blackened by soot, his eyes burning with the cold, clear light of purpose fulfilled. He walked through the silent, parted crowd, not looking at anyone, and went to the bench where Seraphina and Alara waited. He knelt before the little girl and held out a soot-stained hand. She took it without hesitation. He led them away from the burning town, a silent, grim trinity walking towards the dawn. Months later, the world was green. The valley that had once been Seraphina's, and then briefly Silas's, was now simply theirs. The rich black earth, watered by a clean, steady stream, smelled of life and promise. A new, sturdy cabin stood half-finished on a small rise, the clean scent of fresh-cut pine, a stark contrast to the memory of old smoke. Silas stood by a newly plowed patch of land, watching. Alara, her face serious with the importance of her task, carefully placed a small sapling into a hole her mother had dug. She packed the soil around its base with her small hands, her movements gentle and sure. It was a small act in a vast landscape, but Silas saw it for what it was, the beginning of a legacy. Not a legacy of cattle and contracts, but one of roots, growth, and continuation. He looked at the woman and the child, their figures outlined by the warm golden light of the afternoon sun, and he finally understood. He thought his legacy was the empire he had built from the earth, but he now knew his legacy was the family he could raise from the ashes. In the quiet peace of the valley, the broken man finally found his own redemption, not in owning the world, but in protecting one small, precious piece of it.